My name is Kashif Zafar, and I have the privilege of serving on the executive committee of the American-Pakistan Foundation under our chair, Dr. Nasser Qureshi. It's a real privilege to welcome all of you to APF's annual board dinner, a night when we celebrate the excellence and leadership of those in the Pakistani-American community who, through talent, innovation, and service, make us proud to be Americans of Pakistani origin. Tonight, we are tremendously honored to have as our keynote speaker someone who embodies the very ideals that our foundation seeks to promote: intellectual rigor, public impact, and a deep commitment to progress. Dr. Atif Mian is the John H. Laporte Jr. Class of 1967 Professor of Economics, Public Policy, and Finance at Princeton University. He is widely recognized around the world as one of the most influential thinkers of his generation, whose research has shaped how scholars and policymakers understand issues at the intersection of finance, inequality, and economic growth. Born and raised in Pakistan, and with a bachelor's degree in mathematics with computer science from MIT, and a PhD in economics also from MIT, Dr. Mian stands as a remarkable example of a global Pakistani who bridges cultures through knowledge and service. Dr. Mian co-founded the Center for Economic Research in Pakistan, CERP. I think many people in the room have heard of CERP. In 2007, a nonprofit research institute dedicated to economic research, teaching, and innovation. He's also the director of the Julius Rabinowitz Center for Public Policy and Finance at the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. His groundbreaking work and research, including his book, House of Debt, co-authored with Dr. Amir Sufi in 2014, has helped reframe global debates about financial crises, household debt, and the role of policy in building more inclusive communities and economies. Beyond his academic accomplishments, what stands out most about Dr. Mian is his commitment to using ideas to drive change, to ask difficult questions about fairness and opportunity, and to remind us that economic prosperity must serve human dignity. Dr. Mian will speak for about 15 to 20 minutes, and then I will moderate a Q&A with him. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to our keynote speaker, a brilliant scholar, a thought leader, and an inspiring voice for a better world, my good friend, Dr. Atif Mian.
Thank you, Kashif, for those very kind words. Assalamu alaikum, everyone, and special thanks to the American-Pakistan Foundation, Nasser Saab, Ambassador Rizwan Saab. Wonderful to have you all in the audience. Thank you all for coming. We are going to talk about Pakistan, but before I do, I think I'll mention the global affairs first, because there's a very important connection to Pakistan that I'll come to towards the end. I'm an economist. I'm also a very slow thinker, which means I like to think about questions like what was the original sin that got us to where we are, or what might be the original righteous deed that has made us benefit from where we are. And from that perspective, there's something in recent years that has really troubled me and continues to trouble me more and more. And that's something very basic, something very simple. In economics, we know that the collective well-being of any community, and as a world, we are a global community, the collective well-being of any community depends on a system of collaboration. Trade, commerce, contracts, none of that can exist without a sense of norms, without a sense of rule of law, without a sense that we are all in this together at some level. Yeah, there's going to be haves and have-nots and so on, but there's still some system of norms that governs us. And what we have seen over the last few years is a systematic eroding of many of those laws that held us together as a community. And what has instead unleashed itself is exercise of pure hard power. at the expense of any sense of global norms or international law. And the most recent incarnation of that is, of course, the Iran war. I'm going to come back to that, obviously, Iran war, when I talk about Pakistan and its impact on Pakistan. But I want to bring this up front because when you move from a law of norms to a law of jungle, my big fear is that it's not any one country, but it's going to be all of us who are going to start to move towards the Stone Age. And I fear that's where we are heading for many other reasons that I don't have time to get into. But it's important as a starting point to understand, in my view, where the world is today, that it is quite likely, I'm not predicting it, but you have to, whenever you're thinking about policy and strategic policy for that matter, those of you who are in the finance industry, by the way, know this very well. The most important thing is protect principle, right? And for that, you first need to understand the worst case scenarios. And I've just highlighted that the worst case scenario is not just a scenario, it's kind of materializing more and more. And those headwinds are all going to be very negative for the global economy. Just to give you one example, and I don't have time to belabor on it more. In a world where hard power matters, everybody is forced to raise defense spending. Rich, poor, small, big, survival. When everybody moves towards defense spending, you're going to have more and more fiscal pressure. And you're going to have that fiscal pressure in a time when global debt, I kind of work on debt for a living. And global debt to GDP is at its highest, especially sovereign debt. Interest rates are closely linked to that. We are coming out of a period of extremely low interest rates. The world is going to shift. Interest rates, long-term interest rates will only be pushed upwards as a result of all of these forces. Just that one force alone, you can realize how much damage that force itself will do, obviously driven by the underlying original sin of the breaking up of international norms. Okay? So we need to keep that world perspective into mind when we talk about Pakistan. So now let's start talking about Pakistan. What's going to happen to Pakistan as a result of Iran war? To put it succinctly, we can think of Pakistan, again, I'm partly a finance professor as well, so I'm going to use again a financial term. It's a levered play on Iran war. Iran, whatever the negative consequences of Iran war are, they're going to be multiplied when it comes to Pakistan. Why? Pakistan, half of Pakistan's imports are fuel plus food. The very direct consequence of Iran war is price of oil, of course, is rising a lot. And food, by the way, the price of food will, of course, rise, not just because of oil, but because of the key input, which is fertilizer, that depends on exactly the same Strait of Hormuz. All of us are now familiar with that. The key input for fertilizer is also in jeopardy in a serious way. And the next crop cycle is about to start the world over. So food is going to be heavily impacted. Food prices are going to be heavily impacted. As I said, half of Pakistan's imports are food and fuel. But then on the other side of the ledger, Pakistan is one country which depends the most on remittances as part of its exports, if you will, to earn. So half of Pakistan's dollar generation, another way to say that is, remittances are as big as exports of Pakistan. And half of those remittances come from the GCC alone. So obviously those are likely to be negatively impacted. So you're going to get squeezed from both ends, so to speak. But then there's going to be second order knock-on effects because we live in an economy which is interconnected and the production network itself is interconnected by construction. And many of the inputs, or I should say one of the most important input in pretty much everything is fuel. And so you're already seeing, cricket matches are getting shrunk. Students cannot go to schools. The same thing, that production process of education, of exports, but of everything else in the economy is going to get negatively impacted as well. And none of that is going to be positive for GDP growth. At the same time, Pakistan's ability to absorb such an external shock, it's truly an external shock in the financial and economic sense of the word. Pakistan's ability to absorb such a shock is quite limited. For example, if you take Pakistan's forex reserves, it has roughly around 3 months of imports, which is very low by international standards. But also its debt service obligations, both domestic and external, are some of the highest when you look across the world. Just to give you one number, I mean, the net federal receipts of tax revenue, when I say net, I'm taking out the provincial shares under the NFC agreement. They are not even sufficient to pay the interest expense on debt, let alone the pensions of the retired military and civil officers, which is to say you can't even pay for sins of the past, let alone spend on what is needed for education, investment, and growth, right? So it's a very tight situation. But of course, when you're faced with all these fuel shocks and price shocks, there's going to be a natural further squeeze on the fiscal end of the balance sheet, right? So the ability to absorb all these shocks is quite limited. Pakistan already is under an IMF program, and many of the things that the government might want to do for political or other reasons, the IMF is not going to let the country do that. We have lost a fair share of our economic sovereignty, again, because of the sins of the past, okay? So that's interest rate in Pakistan. The central bank will have to keep it high to defend currency, because there will be downward pressure on the currency, among other things. And as I've already said, for all these reasons, GDP growth is likely to be pushed downwards. Now, the last thing I'll say is that all of this is happening at a time when the recent past of Pakistan's economic performance has been quite worrying. Let me just point out two things. The first one is a slightly longer term. If you focus on Pakistan's growth trajectory from the 80s onwards, so at a decadal frequency, if you will, what is most worrying is that Pakistan's economic performance, I've been repeatedly highlighting this as a source of worry from a strategic perspective. Pakistan's growth has gradually been declining to the extent that the last decade it's pretty much stalled. So if you look at growth per capita, it's pretty much stalled in the aggregate. But the second point I'll make in that regard is that not only did growth stall over the last decade, distributionally, it looks really bad. I'll give you two statistics that have come out in recent years, one from a recent survey that the government did, and another also coming from the data that the government collects. And those two facts are that if you look at real consumption of the average Pakistani or the median Pakistani citizen, if you will, this one actually really worries me for another reason I'll try and mention. The caloric intake of the median Pakistani, which is like real consumption that you care about, has actually gone down. It wasn't very high to begin with. But according to the government's own survey, that has actually gone down. The kilograms of meat or cereal that the median, forget the median, even the 75th percentile Pakistani has been eating has gone down appreciably, according to that survey. Number two, if you look at the average real, again, in purchasing power terms, the real purchasing power of daily wage in Pakistan, that reached its peak in 2019, which means it's been going down since then. And today it is at the same level as around 2015. It's a lost decade of purchasing power for the average Pakistani. The reason it particularly disturbs me is because it was already very low. And one thing we know very well, we call this idea poverty traps, that if you already have very low intake of food and health and everything else is combined, right? So if you can't afford enough, obviously you're going to cut back on education or the quality of education, you're going to cut back on the quality of your health and so on. The one key thing we know is that when you cut back from such low levels, like has happened in Pakistan, that has very negative effects for the future because your growth gets impacted. A nutritionally deficient mind cannot produce as much as a fully fed mind. Those things actually matter. And those are the slow undercurrents that are going to continue to have these ripple effects, one generation, 2 generations down the road, right? It's going to pull us down, not move up. Now, I hate to say all of that. Trust me, I find absolutely no pleasure in quoting you all those facts. But we must first face the facts, as I've tried to always say in public. But I fundamentally believe in Pakistan. I fundamentally believe in its potential. That Ambassador Saab talked about it. But we cannot fool ourselves anymore. We have to change course. We have to do things differently. And we must be willing to talk about what are the things that we need to do that will move us in a different direction. That's the important conversation that I hope we can have. Kashif, stop me if I'm going way over. I don't know how much time. And so, there's a lot to talk about in terms of why all of this happened. We must first understand it. There are many physicians in the room, right? Before you prescribe a treatment, you first must diagnose the problem. And so it's very important to first go back to the root causes. I've kept saying, I like to think of the original sins. What were the original sins that have led us to this position? So we can talk about that, and maybe, when we have more time, or depending on your interest, which particular angle you want to focus on, I'll be happy to talk about some of those original sins and how we can move away from those original sins. In the hope of reformation, if you will. But let me just sort of try and close on a couple of additional points. The first one is I want to talk a little bit about sort of the positives, given the Iran war situation. As bad as things might appear from everything that I said, I want to say a few positive things, which I think also will then allow me to make my last remark on the strategic vision that I feel at this point Pakistan needs to have. The positives are that even in the midst of the Iran war, you could see that, just take Pakistani ports becoming more important, right? Because there is turmoil elsewhere. Ambassador Rizwan Saab correctly pointed out of Pakistan's strategic geo-position becoming relatively more important because it is a player that can negotiate with multiple partners at the same time. I agree with that. I think that is a positive. And I also agree with the third positive that also Ambassador Saab mentioned, which is that last year, Pakistan was pushed to the edge because of the attack, unprovoked attack from India. And it is true. I mean, I think a lot of us did not know what will happen. That's the honest truth. And I think it is fair to say that Pakistan came out ahead after that. Now, all of those are positives, especially, that's why this is now, I'm trying to bring it back to why I started with the global. The global environment has radically changed over the last few years, and hard power matters. And for whatever historical reasons, Pakistan has developed capacity towards hard power in ways that are typically not associated with a country of Pakistan's income per capita. The most important of that, perhaps, is the fact that Pakistan is a nuclear power as well. Okay? All of those things matter. You like it or not, whatever your personal beliefs might be about these things, we are living in a law of the jungle, so you have to think like a resident of that jungle. So it is Pakistan's strength. But let me now come towards the future. But before I do, I want to say one thing, which is looking forward, Pakistan is at a very nazuk mode pe hai, right? Hamesha hi hota hai, but it's this time is it's a little different. And I want to bring it back to the finance again. That's finance analogy that I gave. That you have to protect your portfolio first. You have to protect your principal first. And I think as much as I've talked about in the past, of Pakistan needs to have a growth vision and this and that and so on. Times are very different. You have to understand where Pakistan is today. You have to understand where the world and the global situation is today. And faced with those realities, I see little hope to say, Pakistan should have 10% per capita growth in whatever the next 5 years or so. I just don't see it. But I think it's extremely important that you protect the principle. It's extremely important that you have a very strong defense, politically, strategically, economically, and you have to have that mindset. And you'll have to change. And again, when I say you have to change, I'm talking about, again, the deeper original sins of Pakistan in the past. You'll have to change. You'll have to change, not just for growth, you'll have to change to protect your principle in this very dangerous situation that Pakistan is finding itself, not just economically, but globally for many different reasons. What that means is that this is not just the time to talk about economics and what the right economic policy is. This is also the time to talk about diplomacy and what the right what the right diplomatic strategy has to be in Pakistan. So have to have clarity on what that is. The one thing that matters the most in the fog of war is to have clarity of what principles are going to guide you. I fundamentally believe in life that if you don't have first principles, you're just like a random walk, because you don't know how to make decisions if you don't have first principles, because it's only going back to those first principles that can guide you in completely new situations, how to handle it and how to make a decision in those terms. Pakistan needs to figure out what those first principles are, and I'll try to highlight what I believe, so I'll close on that. What I believe should be Pakistan's first principles as it tries to strategically move forward. I think Pakistan's, and it's very much aligns with sort of, at least, again, like Ambassador Saab said, I have no insight, neither should I, because these things are better kept done quietly. But it's good that, Pakistan is trying to bring people together. I think the very first principle that Pakistan should follow is the principle of peace, and is the principle of not leaning in any one direction too heavily. That's a dancing act, that's a balancing act. There should absolutely be no doubt that Pakistan cannot take sides in any one party versus the other. It's a trap, don't fall into it. The other aspect I want to emphasize is that the definition of peace, it's not, it's sometimes like, okay, we are these big players and let me do this geopolitical bargain. Of course, that's part of it. But perhaps the more important, and I think for Pakistan, the more difficult question is, you must work on bringing peace within Pakistan. That's where the hard conversations are going to be, Ambassador Saab. It's not going to be with other countries. It's going to be with your own people. The most difficult thing for a country, every country can survive if it has peace and unity within, whether it has nuclear weapon or not. And people, you talked about external powers, and I agree that external powers have various nefarious plans. The only way they can succeed is if they leverage the divisions within. And the question I will have for the government moving forward is, are you going to move differently on that margin? Are you going to work on bringing communities together rather than encouraging the forces that split communities apart inside Pakistan? So again, and this is a serious conversation, and we must talk honestly about these conversations. Those are the two most important things. On the economic side, I'll say this one last thing, and then Kashif, we can chat. On the economic side, there are some massive changes that need to happen. But the most important thing is that the current model of earning rents, for lack of a better word, because it's not really output, is not sustainable. Pakistan has to cut spending in ways which are intelligent to bring consumption down and raise space for investment and other types of spending. And this is all the wrong kind of consumption, which is rent seeking. We have to bring taxes down on the people who can produce something and raise them for people who are just sitting on unearned capital, like land that they have essentially stolen from public lands and given it to themselves on way undervalued prices. Just to give you one example, we cannot afford this anymore. As I said, this is a race, a battle for survival. We can talk the good talk. Do you want to defend this country or not? You'll have to make that sacrifice of the paid, if you will. The average Pakistani has already cut their calorie intake. Will the top, I don't even know what percent it is anymore. Will they take the hit? Will they be willing to take the hit or not for a bigger cause? One thing I know as an economist, if you do the changes that might look hard in the short run, if they are good for the collective, I'm going to end on this positive note. I always say, as bad as Pakistan's problems are, they are really minuscule. Every problem I mentioned, the debt and so on, the exports and so on, it's absolutely nothing. It's a few $1 billion here and there. I mean, it's depressing that those small numbers have hijacked a country of 250 million people. But the good news is they're really small problems. If you start moving in a positive direction, again, I'm going to use another financial term, in present value terms, you can get out of all of those problems very quickly. But again, it's going to come back to making those hard decisions and then sticking to it in the long run. That has to be institutionalized. Again, how to do that, we can talk about. But thank you so much. It's
move this up a little bit. Wow. Thank you, Atif, for those remarks. Shared a lot of facts with us. As you said, we have to face the truths. So two things. Number one, if that was hard to swallow, there is dessert on the table. So please make sure that you have. I tried the kheer. It is absolutely delightful. I think there's gajar halwa as well. But, I'm going to save some space for later on. Ambassador Saab had invoked the analogy with the mother. So I'm going to start with my mother, who's 81 years old in Karachi. And when I was speaking to her this morning and I mentioned that Dr. Atif Mian will be a keynote speaker if she had any questions for him, because she's living in Pakistan. And the first thing she said, well, is that the guy you keep telling me is going to win the Nobel Prize in economics one day? And Atif is very modest, but he is touted by many to have a very good shot based on his fundamental research that he's done through time. And I'm also told that in many fields, some people get Nobel Prizes early on. We obviously have Malala, who got it as a teenager, that in economics, and he's only a young 51, I think, or 50. So in economics, you typically get it a bit later. I think the average economist who gets it is about 65, if I was doing my math right early on. So we have some time. Anyway, so the first question my mother asked me to ask you was, given the fact that her she's very happy that her son earns in dollars, she was saying, if you keep telling me that things will probably get worse with this, I think the petrol hike now over the last month is about 72%. You've gone from about somewhere around 250, 60 rupees of petrol to 450 plus. And her question was because she watches the dollar. I think somebody said their mother earlier on today is the day trader. My mother is like an FX trader. And what she wanted me to ask you to kick things off was, can you please ask this genius guy, is the Pakistani rupee okay at 280, or is it going to get worse from here, given everything that you keep telling me about in the news and what's going on with the Iran war?
Because your mother asked, I have to tell the truth, right? I can't sugarcoat it. Look, all the pressures are for all the reasons I mentioned, is for the rupee to depreciate, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, given because you have to face reality of the global prices, so it's and there's one other comparison you can do. You can look at the neighboring country, India, which has a lot more sort of capacity to absorb these external shocks and so on. But if you were to compare the Indian rupee to the Pakistani rupee recently, you will see that the Indian rupee has depreciated, which is to say that they have absorbed these shocks more through their exchange rate than Pakistan. So I do want to say one thing, that I think it's, and I totally understand why people whose savings are in one currency or the other care about that. That's very understandable. But from a macroeconomic perspective, it is not a good habit to think of the exchange rate as a metric of how the country is doing. Maybe a better way of saying that is, it's not the fundamental or the structural variable that determines a country's success. Because what Pakistani politicians then sometimes try and do is they try to artificially control the value of the dollar, even though the underlying dynamics have shifted. And that leads to bigger troubles when ultimately the dam bursts and you have to devalue because you're running out of foreign exchange and so on. So the exchange rate is just like, it's just like your body's temperature. Yeah, we know what fever looks like, but you just can't blame the fever. You have to understand the underlying cause of the fever. And so the reality is that if Pakistan wants a strong currency, I'll tell you as an economist, what determines a strong currency. What determines a strong currency is your level of productivity. If Pakistan becomes a lot more productive, it can have a stronger currency. Simple as that. And so the first order reason why Pakistan's currency has continued to devalue is that Pakistan's productivity has not kept pace with the rest of the world. It is exactly that generates the balance of payment prices for the same exchange rate, because you cannot afford, if the rest of the world is becoming more productive, you cannot sell them the same goods if you're still using the same employees to have the same level of output. You will not compete with them because now they can produce the same output with half the number of employees. The same exchange rate math doesn't work. That's the simple connection. So focus on domestic productivity if you want your currency to be strong. And again, we didn't have time to talk about this, but when we talk about all of the economic kind of strategic change in direction, the key thing is we must focus on domestic productivity, on our domestic resources. I have been a heavy critic of governments, current, past, they have all been done the same. They first look outside for economic policy. CPEC, SIFC, this or that. That is not how growth happens. I'm not disagreeing with any of those things, but they are marginal things. You do those things at the end. खाना बनाने के बाद आप ऊपर थोड़ा सा वो तड़का लगा देते हैं. That's it. It's तड़का. Thank you, Imran. It's not your main ingredient of growth. That's totally different. But they don't understand. It's not that they don't, they're smart people. I have a sense of why they go in that direction. Because the political economy deems it more convenient because of more of a rent-based economy that we have developed. Happy to go into it, but I don't want to go that line right now.
So let's probably go towards that a bit, right? So a former World Bank economist once told me that the intelligent design of incentive systems within a country, whether it's for your teachers, it's for your police officers, it's for your military, it's for your politicians, it's for your judges and everything else. An intelligent design of incentive systems with the right checks and balances allows a society to develop and grow in the way that you've done. And we've seen many examples of that around the world. Countries have succeeded. It takes 20, 30 years. You can't turn around a large country in a few years. What do you think are the specific design flaws in the incentive systems in Pakistan that actually can be changed through leadership, through consensus building within the country? You talked about how things are wrong. What could be done to design incentive systems as we move through time?
So talking about first principles, I fundamentally believe that all humans are equal in the following sense. They're all equally bad. And they're all equally good, right? It's not that the Chinese are better than us. It's not like we are more corrupt than the Chinese or the Americans are. No, it's not. It's all, that's all sort of yes. Exactly. So then, so you have to say, okay, so I'll just pick China as an example, or I could have picked Korea, would have been similar conversation. You see, the elite are the elite everywhere. And the elite, just like all humans first, you care about your child first, and then you think of anyone else's, right? And so the elite first try to protect themselves or think about their interest. And yeah, it is true that you can develop those checks and balances where you kind of keep them on a tighter leash, but they all have bigger sway than the average person. That's the definition of the elite. And so the Chinese elite have also looked out for themselves. And there is corruption in China as well, maybe even more than Pakistan, I don't know. But the one difference is that they just happen to build the incentives differently. So if you were the elite in China, it was in your self-interest to promote through this big network of subsidized lending and things like that, and local government spending on infrastructure and where that money goes and who gets the contract and all of that. But the entire incentive system was very deliberately designed around two main metrics. It literally is called the Mandarin system of growth. People have studied that. And the incentive design was that you will be promoted higher, and hence you'll get bigger pay, whatever, and maybe more opportunities for corruption. I don't know, I'm just making things up because, I don't want. But you had to produce higher GDP in the local city, province, wherever you were in charge of. You were literally measured on local GDP, number one. And number two, you were incentivized to work on tradable and export sector. So you have more to sell to the rest of the world. That incentive mechanism then kicked off what then became the incredible Chinese success story. Okay, now let's bring it to Pakistan. In Pakistan, our elite, this is why I talked about getting under invoicing, whatever you want to call it, valuing land, translate over in your name for one reason or another. The schemes differ, but that's pretty much what is happening. And then not paying any capital gain on either that or even when you sell it. How can the country afford it? That land always existed. Think of the macroeconomic. Those are your incentives. You've just gotten that big pot of money in your land, in your pocket out of that land. That you haven't done anything. The country has not, it's not that you have anything to sell to the rest of the world as a result of that. But now it's in your pocket. Now you are the elite, right? What are your incentives? You want to go to Dubai, maybe not these days, but you want to go to New York? You want to go to Saks, Fifth Avenue, whatever it is? You want to import that BMW? How do you maximize the value of this rent seeking that you have just done, which is of a different nature than what the Chinese do? The Chinese might skim off some profits of, it's fine. How do you maximize this? The only way you can maximize this is through an appreciated exchange rate. You need to get dollars inside the country so you can go and travel to Dubai. Because people, the Arabs or the Americans or the Europeans are not interested in your land. So they don't want to live there. So you must generate dollars somehow. And Pakistani elite hit a gold mine with the remittances. They're like, let's push them out. So when those dollars come in, this is the sad reality of political economy of Pakistan. I mean, it sounds like, and now sounds like a Marxist, but data is what it is. It's the poor of Pakistan who perpetuate the living standards of the elite of Pakistan. That is an absolute reality. I've already told you, half of Pakistan's foreign earnings are because of remittances. And they're all poor people by and large. The rich people who come here, they don't send anything back. They even sell their property and bring it back. So it's all poor people of Pakistan. Again, I sound like I'm just giving you the truth. I'm not here to stand for any elections. I have to change this system. You have to understand, first of all, this is the system we have been living in. You can make whatever excuses you want, but this is the reality I'm telling you. We have to change it. This is going to be hard. This requires structural change, and we cannot afford it anymore. Those remittances are going to... I study economics, but there is this sense of a philosophical sense in economics, which is when you're working, it's like nature has its own ways of pushing you or slapping you and telling you you're going in the wrong direction. That's the price mechanism. Those are the exchange rate, and so on. This system is not sustainable. You cannot, and people have, now it's just become so obvious. Pakistan's model of growth is not sustainable at a high level of growth because of these kind of features that I've just talked about. So you have to shift it. It's a different commitment you need, but we need to start today. I mean, I can give you many other examples on these incentives. I'll just give you one example. I mean, we need to have even the most recent, like the IMF program, the incentives. The IMF program had all the right macro numbers, and who can disagree with those? You have to balance your books and all of that. But the micro matters, which is where the incentives come in. Who do you tax and who do you not tax? They put super tax on the most productive people, the professional class that was already getting crushed. You're disincentivizing the productive inputs into the economy. And you've completely let go the other piece, which I've already mentioned. But the other thing that they did is, again, relative prices matter. They tax electricity. How stupid does it look now in looking back? I mean, I talked about it openly back a couple of years ago as well. You're taxing electricity, and relatively, you're not putting that burden on fuel, which is an import. If you must raise revenue, as bad as it sounds, raise petrol prices, but bring because you want to incentivize a shift in production towards domestic resources. Pakistan is the best place for solar energy. It's a symptom. It represents a failure of the system that Pakistan has like 25% of its electricity roughly is now solar, but all of it is like retail.
And it's been disincentivized.
And it's been disincentivized, right?
Well,
but it's a function of that. Despite the government not wanting it at some level, it's telling you how productive solar generation is. But think of, I don't want to belabor this point. I've said it so many times. I mean, just 10 years ago, the government signed these contracts of power plants, coal-based, fossil fuel-based, and so on. 10 years ago, just 10 years ago. It's not like we didn't know solar at that time. I mean, what are you thinking? What are you doing? So, anyways, yes, incentives. We have to change the deep incentives, the structural incentives of the system of economy, and we must do it because we have to protect the principle.
So I was in Pakistan in December and sat down for lunch with a couple of my friends who happened to be CEOs of some of the largest banks in Pakistan. And one of the things they shared with me was, and then as I think most people in the room know, most of Pakistan's debt is domestic debt, 70-80% of it. We do have a hard currency debt. There's very little of it in the public markets. So a few billion that the way many other large EM economies have done, which is you restructure your foreign debt. So most of your debt is either to other countries or to multilateral organizations. That is the hard currency debt, and then the rest of it is domestic. And one of the things that those guys mentioned was that about 3-4 years ago, when you look at a bank's balance sheet, you have deposits and you make loans that drive the economy to companies and individuals. And then you have government bonds that banks buy. The same thing here with Bank of America, with Citibank, with everybody else. Since the financial crisis, a higher percentage because of regulation and the need for the government in the US to borrow debt, borrow money, has been a higher and higher percentage. So in Pakistan, last time we had this conversation 3-4 years ago, the number was roughly 30% of Pakistan's deposits are going into government bonds, i.e. the government is borrowing from the depositors via the banks. And the rest of it going towards the economy, which is a good thing because you have some crowding out, but not as much crowding out. And what they shared with me was that now that number has gone to 70% of the deposits are now going towards lending the money to the government. Obviously, your external sources of debt have dried up. Your ability to more hard currency from the friendly countries has dried up. So what does that mean, if you can explain that to our audience? When you have your tax revenue is not covering basically your interest expense, let alone paying down debt. And then your debt is ballooning at a speed where basically you're crowding out the rest of the economy. So I hear your kind of dire predictions, and I want to kind of understand from a layman's terms, what does that mean and where are we headed in the next year or 2 years?
Right. So first, just to summarize the key fact, which is what Kashif was referring to, is that if you look at the loan book of Pakistani banks, they pretty much, the loan book says they borrow from the depositors and they lend to the government. That's it. And they make the spread. It's like the best business in town. They don't do much otherwise. I mean, I'm a bit like, I'm sure the bank CEOs will not be happy with me to say that, but that's pretty much what's happening. And this is like not normal. Like by any international standard, the share of loan book that is just lent to the government, and this is the classic thing in economics, we call it crowding out. You're crowding out private borrowing, which is the engine of growth. Public borrowing is not the engine, especially in a country like Pakistan, because you can look at the government's spending, and the government basically just pays salaries and stuff. It doesn't really do any investment. It should be doing that, but that's another story. And obviously you cannot create debt without deficits, right? That's just the accounting. And so what that reflects is the uncontrolled level of borrowing or the high level of deficits, put differently, that the government has been running. Now, there's the basic math of deficits is that the best way to pay for deficits is to grow, especially for a country like Pakistan. And you can actually sustain some decent level of deficits if you're growing. But the whole thing turns on its head. If you're not growing and you're running high level deficit, then the same level of deficit becomes a noose around your neck, and it actually starts pulling growth downwards, and you get into that negative cycle. And that's basically what has happened in Pakistan for a number of years. Again, for all these many structural reasons that I talked about it. But there's a second very important reason that has fed into that dynamic, that negative dynamic of what makes debt more unsustainable as you push growth downwards. This is exactly why this is why I say all those things are so important, that don't start with CPEC and SIFC. Start with domestic investment. Start with trying to boost domestic investment first. And you'll have to change the tax regime, for example. Again, talking about relative incentives. How much are you going to be taxed? Do the math. If you set up a manufacturing plant that has whatever, maybe 10 years of payback period, and it's stuck in the ground, anyone can come and kind of hassle you, versus you just kind of speculate on property and turn land over and so on, and try to build government connections that will tell you where the next road is going to come in and all of that stuff. The businessmen just either went in that direction, and those who were not interested in that game, again, you talked about your talking to CEOs. When I try to go back to Pakistan very regularly. I was just there for about a month. I'll only ask one question to if I have to meet any businessmen or CEOs. How much are you investing in Pakistan? And they all said the same thing. Yes, we have free cash flow, but we are doing it here or there in some other country, which is not Pakistan. I said this in one of the podcasts recently that, one of the most successful stories coming out of Pakistan was Kareem, which is a Pakistan story. And now Kareem doesn't even exist in Pakistan. It's still a multi-billion-dollar story. But all of that financial surplus is in Dubai or wherever. It's not in Pakistan. It's not in Lahore. It's not in Karachi. We have to think differently to encourage investment in Pakistan and then for that investment to stay inside Pakistan. The other fact I'll tell you is that even the investment that happens in Pakistan, they try to set up an offshore location so that they only just cross their expenses with the revenue and all the profit goes outside. You must develop an environment where the profit wants to stay in Pakistan. And that's again the Kareem example that I was referring to. So we have to focus on what will change the incentives of the private businesses, because you cannot force them. That's the reality. You cannot force people, you cannot force private businesses. And so you have to work on that rather than saying, how can we lean even more to some foreign prince and get an extra $1 billion in? I'll talk, we talked again, I fundamentally believe in the promise of Pakistan, which is why it infuriates me how the lack of vision at times among the leadership of Pakistan. What are you doing? Like, you can make 10 times that much more easily. And this war, by the way, I hope there is a realization that many of the other people are actually living on a house of cards. And the real investment, and there is a narrative to be sold here. But you must lead with real actions that signal credibly that we are going to do the affairs of the state differently than what we have done in the past. For that promise and potential to realize. I fundamentally believe that this can be done. So again, my point in saying all of this is not to act like an angry WhatsApp uncle, but it's because it's trying to say that, look, if there is be more positive. That's what I mean. Like, have a bigger vision. It's achievable, it's attainable, but you'll have to do things differently.
So if we move this forward, I think, we've talked about, you mentioned the IMF package. I think Pakistan has had, lost count, 24, 26, 28 packages from the IMF. I believe none of them have been completed properly with the wishes of the IMF. So a couple of questions there. One, there is a big debate within the US, around the developing world, within Pakistan, that kind of IMF is the bad guy. And IMF policies are tough on people, this and that. So one, wanting to get your thoughts on that. And then the second one is, Atif is somebody for the many years that I've known him, has stuck to economics. But what I found today, and I deeply appreciate your care and love for Pakistan, you've talked about things a bit outside of the economy as well, because the geopolitics matters and obviously how elites run a country matters as well. So thoughts on the IMF in terms of what it asks Pakistan to do, and two, there's an argument to be made that nobody wants a country with 250 million Muslims, with however many nuclear weapons that Pakistan has, to default on its debt. And that's the reason why we have kept kicking the can down the road as a country, if you look at from Pakistan's perspective, because nobody really knows what to do. And I think it's becoming pretty clear now that there's a lot of evidence when you look at other situations as to why the world wouldn't want to do that. But, and the third, I apologize for a long string of questions, is what I want to know is, if you do get to that point in reckoning, I do know as a banker who's worked in emerging markets for decades, that there is the other side of it. But the pain that the poor people could potentially suffer can be very insufferable. So do you think, one, the IMF is treating Pakistan fairly and other third world countries? Is there some things they could be doing differently? Number two, if a day of reckoning is to come, which I think is still a big if, and the world will have to figure out how to solve that dilemma because Pakistan has nuclear weapons. And three, is there examples of countries that went through a lot of economic pain that have come out on the other side? I was just in Brazil last week for work. That's a country when I was a junior banker, I remember looking at a prospectus for a bond deal, and it said their currency from 1925 to 1995 had devalued so much that there were 12 zeros after the original currency from 1925.
Yeah, well, first of all, sort of taking your last question, there are many countries that have come out of the IMF and have done extremely well coming out of it. Just to give one example is like Korea. Because they learned, I mean, for them, it was like a national humiliation of sorts that they had to go to the IMF. And one of the results of that national humiliation for them was that they lost part of their sovereignty for a while. And so, for example, they were forced to sell some of their assets to foreigners to kind of square the debt, so to speak. And so they really learned, and in fact, many Asian countries learned. And so it's not a coincidence that right after that East Asian crisis of the late 90s, that you see Korea and all of the other East Asian countries, and then China jumps in, of course. You see all of them accumulating massive reserves at the central bank. And they start putting in all kinds of macroprudential regulations of capital controls. Okay, we are not going to let foreign money in to speculate on land and real estate, which has all of those things that make you go back to the IMF. So they learned their lesson and they did something about it. And they have never gone back to the IMF, of course, as a result of that. We know all of, again, this is like part of the thing, it's like, it's a science, there's a bit of, but we know the basic things that work, that you're not supposed to go to the IMF. That's the thing. So it's not, you cannot fault the IMF for doing whatever they do afterwards. You have to understand you're not supposed to go to them in the first place. So you have to understand, you have to have the right sort of cause and effect to be able to understand the problem. And this was the silliness of some of the recent conversation, if you recall, before Pakistan went into the most recent IMF program. For a while, there were these politicians and saying, oh no, we don't need to, we'll show the IMF. Like, if you don't have foreign currency, you don't have foreign currency. You can't print it. So you need to understand and accept, first of all, if you have made a blunder, but then reform and change. This is what Pakistan has been unable to do. And it's a matter of shame, right? Pakistan has the world record at this point. Used to be Jamaica. We overcame, we beat them this last time, the most recent IMF program. Pakistan is the country with the highest number of IMF programs. In an IMF program longer than we've been out of an IMF program. So, I mean, I'll be repeating myself, right? You have to change. I mean, you mentioned the nuclear weapons and the Muslims. I mean, I'll say one thing. I mean, the world is prejudiced, right? I don't care about those kinds of views. Pakistan has a nuclear weapon, many other countries have a nuclear weapon too. I mean, if you have to think fairly about the world that you're going to live in, right? But the Muslims are not as trustworthy as, I mean, this is just outright racism, right? So I think we have to, this is not on. We don't need to have an inferiority complex. You can be Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, or whatever. But the sense of associating negativity with a very important part of our identity, we associate ourselves with the Muslim faith. I mean, what does that have to do with anything else? So I think we need to assert ourselves properly. We need to acknowledge when we are making a mistake, and we need to correct ourselves. Simple as that.
It's great. We're going to open it up to 2-3 max questions from the audience.
First of all, thank you very much, Dr. Mian, for being here.
So would you mind just taking the mic? Do we have the mic?
Yes, we do.
First of all, thank you so much, Dr. Mia, for being here. My question is more around how you mentioned that we go towards external policies like CPAC, but we never look at internal policies. My question would be, how do you feel about the NFC award coming in as the federal government using that as a leverage on the provincial governments to increase formalization? Because right now what we see is provincial governments and municipal governments don't even collect any taxes. And if they use that as a negotiation tool, do you think we can get to a place where our economy is more formalized? Because right now, more than 57% of our pool goes to the provinces and federal government keeps less. So just curious.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's actually a very good example of the question that Kashif asked about incentives or the deep structural incentives, right? And so the NFC award is a very important thing from that perspective. Just so people who don't know, NFC award basically demarcates total pool of revenue that Pakistan collects between the provinces. And all of that is very good, by the way. You know, I mean, spending needs to devolve to the local level, so it actually should not even stay at the provincial level. It needs to go down to the city, district, and so on, rural units and all of that, which, by the way, is extremely important for Pakistan to do, and it hasn't been done, which is devolving political power down to the local level. And it's tangential to your question, but the reason it's extremely important is that if you're interested in creating the next generation of political class in Pakistan, I should say one thing, that all of these strategic changes and all of that we are talking about, it can only be done through politicians. I have a great respect for politicians because they are the ultimate intermediary between the people and the sort of the centers of power. But to produce future politicians, they're not going to start with the big election. They're going to start with the small election. And so you need to have those small elections to create that political class. So it's extremely important. But coming back to your NFC question, the problem with NFC question is one of incentives. You need to give incentives to the same local authorities to collect revenue as well. And that has all been put on the shoulders of the federal government that is just sitting in Islamabad, trying to raise revenue so it can just give that. So it's terrific to be a chief minister in Pakistan, but you don't want to be a prime minister in Pakistan, right? That's sort of the logic. But that's not good logic. That's not good incentives.
Kashif, can we read the last question? Sure. Let's go there with the lady there.
So I've been following what's happening in Bangladesh. I'm sure you have too. So they got so fed up, they threw out the government. And they seem to be doing all these reforms. But do you think they're going to work? Do you think there's an economist running the country?
He's not.
Yes. But are they on the right track? Because the reforms you're talking about, I don't see the current government doing most of it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know enough about Bangladesh to really answer your question, to be honest. They've done some wonderful things in the past, especially like education, incorporating women in the labor force properly. I think the sort of the secular form of government is exactly the right kind of government for any country to have. So I think they've had a lot of good things. Whether they go in the right direction or not, I mean, I think the major question for them is like they need to get the big things done on energy, on agriculture, things like that. So they've done the small pieces like producing T-shirts and so on. They've done very well on that, but they need to get the big stuff now done as well. So that's the major challenge I think that they face.
Kashif, there's one young fellow who really wants to ask a question, so I'll sacrifice mine. Go ahead.
Oh, thank you.
The mic, sorry.
Hi. I like that you mentioned the solar panels, and I've been researching a lot quite. You said we had 25% of the energy coming from solar. What can we do to get it to 30-35? Because right now what I'm seeing is net metering is getting worse. The rates are getting worse. Can we have a plan with the government that can ever be incentivizing large landowners to bring large solar panels for them to sell electricity? Is that a limited quantity right now? Are they not allowed to do it? I'm personally a little unaware of this topic, but I would love to hear your thoughts and see what limitations are there, since obviously there's representatives here that would probably we covered. So any advice on your end for that type of program to help boost the energy through solar?
I mean, I think the main thing is that the government has to get out of the way fundamentally. So they have been trying to subsidize the rest of the government by taxing electricity, basically. And that's like the first sort of one of the fundamental laws of economics, that you let sunk cost pay sunk cost and you let people kind of benefit from and produce at marginal cost. And so to put that burden of deficits elsewhere on the production of electricity, that's one of the major reasons why the incentive to invest in the energy sector is incorrect. That's number one. And number two, in the past, energy policies have just, for example, under the IPP policies, you could bring in a coal-powered plant and whatever, and so on, as was done, this was the 10 years ago, and you would get sovereign guarantees on a minimum rate of return in dollars of like close to 20%, if I remember correctly, on your return on equity. Everything backed by the state. What incentive do you have to think about the long-run economics of a coal-powered plant versus a solar plant? If that's the set of policies that you have, right? So you need to get out of the way, you need to change those kinds of policies, and you certainly don't need to tax a sector unfairly.
Thank you.
I'm just going to ask the last question. Yes or no answer.
This is the third last.
This is the third last question. Yes or no? We need to get everybody home. We need to get you home. I know you have to get back to Princeton as well. The question that you were sort of the way you were going around the incentive systems and the question about Bangladesh. Do you think the hybrid model can survive in Pakistan?
I don't know. I mean,
Yes or no?
Yes or no question?
no, it's, I've given up on hybrid or non-hybrid in a way, because as I said, you have to protect the principle. I think one thing that I will say is this is partly what I meant by, I mean, it's too long a last question.
Kashif,
I think hybrid or non-hybrid, there are very serious problems with hybrid from a practical standpoint, which is that for a large country like Pakistan, you cannot run business off the books. Like, why? It's not, that's the problem with the hybrid system, that it's off the books. Somebody has formal authority, but someone else has a real authority. I get an official message from one, I get a phone call from another. Who am I supposed to listen to? No, I mean, it's a serious, I don't mind it either way. I have given up on all principles on this issue. I'm just giving you a practical reality of things. You run into problems. So fix it a little bit on that margin. Have a power sharing compromise, whatever. These things happen. Even the kings in UK gave up some power and there was a rearrangement. These things happen. Do it properly. Do power sharing properly. Share power. I want to go back to Pakistan. So share power, but do it intelligently. That is what I'll say. Corruption bhi karni hai to karo, but do it in the national interest.
If China got it right, Korea got it right, there's a lot of hope for Pakistan as well. Thank you very much, Atif.